Hi, everybody, and welcome. It's the Yaron Brook Show on this Monday evening, and I know it's those of us on the East Coast. It's getting late. It's already 8 p.m. Hope you had a good dinner. Those of you on the West Coast, just starting out and maybe just coming back from work. So thank you for joining me. I appreciate that. And whoops, let me do this. I forgot to get Facebook online. So. They seem to be online now, so we can get going. All right, so as I said, Yaron Brook Show, and I thought today I've done a bunch of shows kind of answering your questions. Of course, you can always ask questions on the Super Chat on YouTube. And please, those of you who are not subscribed to my YouTube channel, please go on and subscribe today if you can. But I thought what I'd do today is talk a little bit about the financial crisis, talk a little bit about Lehman Brothers, and the reason is that it's 10 years since Lehman went bankrupt and the financial crisis erupted in full force. And, it'll be September 15th when the exact date of the Lehman bankruptcy. I was going to wait until the 15th, but my worry is that I won't have won't be doing any kind of open-ended shows before then, and I really wanted to take this opportunity to talk about the financial crisis because I think to a large extent we're still suffering from the financial crisis. Maybe not so much economically, although I definitely think we are suffering economically still from the consequences of the financial crisis. I certainly think we're suffering economically from the response to the financial crisis by government and by the Federal Reserve. But I also think we're suffering politically for the financial crisis. So I don't think you can fully understand the rise of Donald Trump. I don't think you can understand kind of the shift in Americans' attitudes towards freedom, towards free trade, towards free markets, without understanding the financial crisis, its causes, and ultimately its misdiagnosis, which is what I want to talk about primarily today, not so much about the causes, because if you're interested in the causes, I did a long course on that, and you can listen to that course both on YouTube and on a bunch of podcasting apps. But I'm more interested in how we understand the financial crisis, how people diagnose the financial crisis, and therefore have responded to the financial crisis and have set us up for the response in the future to future economic crises, which we're not going to avoid. There's going to be another financial crisis down the road, and how we responded to the previous financial crisis will to a large extent determine how we respond to future financial crises and to future economic crises. And therefore, it's important to understand what we did, how we did it, why we did it, and what the conclusions we came to. We talk a lot about the rise of socialism or positive attitudes towards socialism in the United States, the rise of populism in the United States and all over Europe. Generally, broadly speaking, the rise of statism. And everywhere I go, the common response to my critique of the rise of statism is, but we tried free markets and they gave us a financial crisis. But we tried to rely on capitalism and unregulated financial markets, and what did we get? We got the financial crisis. And there's a whole generation, if you think about it, if you are 22 today, then you were 12 when the financial crisis happened. And you have grown up with a particular explanation for the financial crisis. You have grown up with a particular response by government for the financial crisis. You have grown up with a particular view of how markets work, how markets should work, what is the role of government, what is the purpose of government. And the tragedy and the catastrophe of it is there have been almost no dissenting voices. There have been almost no people to challenge the conventional view. Everybody, and we'll talk about this, left and right, Republican and Democrat, have basically agreed on the fundamentals of what happened, on how we got out of it and why we're where we are today. They don't want to talk about the damage that has been done, the lives that were destroyed, other than as examples of beware of capitalism, beware of free markets, beware of freedom, beware of banks. And over the next week, you are going to see dozens and dozens and dozens of newspaper articles, op-eds, covers of magazines, websites, and all dedicated to the lessons learned. Have we learned the lessons from the financial crisis? Can it happen again? If it happens again, what will we do? The Economist. What is the title of the Economist? The front page or the front of the magazine has a picture of New York skyscrapers, banks, one would assume, all of course in black, very dark gray, black, ominous, peering down at us. And they've got Band-Aids on them. They got Band-Aids all over the place. And the headline is, "The world has not learned the lessons of the financial crisis. Banks are safer, but too much of what has gone wrong since 2008 could happen again." Now, that's true. The whole title is true. The world has not learned the lessons of the financial crisis. But we're going to talk about the lessons that The Economist has taken from the financial crisis. Now, there are some out there who have this notion that The Economist is a pro-free market, pro-capitalism, or at least pro-Wall Street, conventional, whatever, markets magazine. Now, it truly is conventional. But The Economist is a Keynesian publication. It's been a Keynesian, a neo-Keynesian, but a Keynesian pro-government intervention, pro-government spending, pro-government stimulus, anti-cutting regulation, anti-cutting taxes publication, one of the leading kind of left-of-center publications in the world. Now, maybe it's right-of-center in a crazy world in which the entire spectrum is statist and in which the center is moderate statism. But the idea that The Economist, or any publication out there that I know of, once in a while, the editorial pages, editorial board of the Wall Street Journal would exhibit some signs of pro-free market life. Doesn't last them very long. Doesn't last very long. But The Economist is a rag when it comes to economics. It's called The Economist, after all. Its economics are third rate, and statist through and through. So, 10 years ago, leading up to September 15th and the bankruptcy of Lehman, there was much panic, and the world was quite distraught. Rumors of Lehman's demise were all over the place. Its stock was plummeting. Lenders were withdrawing financing. And everybody was looking to John Paulson, the Treasury Secretary, and to Ben Bernanke to see what they would do. The bank went into the weekend on the premise that the weekend would be spent hammering out a deal by which the government would bail them out in one way or another, probably by cutting a deal with some other bank to buy them out and to take them out. Didn't happen. By Sunday night, it was obvious that Lehman Brothers, that the government was not going to bail Lehman Brothers out, that they were going to be allowed to go bankrupt. Monday morning, indeed, they declared bankruptcy. They fired many of the employees. They kept a skeleton crew to kind of wind down the business. People think, I mean, this is interesting, just as a side note. People think that bankruptcy means everything gets shut down, you close the doors, and everybody goes home, and it just rots there. And sometimes that's what happens when a small business goes bankrupt. But even then, it's not what happens, and certainly not when a large business goes bankrupt. When a large business goes bankrupt, basically what happens is the CEO stays in place, management stays in place until they are maybe replaced by a court, by managers that a court appoints. All the parties that, the asset holders, the owners, the representatives, shareholders, which is basically the board of directors, and all the creditors, the people that the business owes money to, go into a courtroom and they start negotiating. In the meantime, the new management that's appointed by the court of law is usually put in charge of the institution, in this case, the investment bank, to unwind its assets and to return as much of the debt that it owed as possible. In the case of Lehman Brothers, let me just find this, these numbers. In the case of Lehman Brothers, when it went bankrupt, it had $639 billion, that's at the B, $639 billion of assets and $619 billion of debt. So technically, it wasn't bankrupt. Technically, bankruptcy is when you owe more money than you have, right? When your liabilities exceed your assets. Lehman indeed did not have a technical bankruptcy. It had more assets than its liabilities, than its debt. Every dollar that Lehman owed was ultimately paid back. Not paid back with full interest and everything, but every dollar that Lehman owned was ultimately, it took about 3.5 years, it was paid back. Now, I know this because, I have some personal experience here because I had kind of funds tied up with Lehman Brothers. I was at the time consulting to a hedge fund that was based in Kentucky, and they had their portfolio being traded with Lehman, so Lehman had that portfolio, and we were making money. We were buying and selling, and we had been making money for this hedge fund, and we had a deal with the hedge fund that if we made X amount of money, we would get a certain percentage of the profits. And on, I think, September 16th or 17th or 18th, it might have taken about a week, actually, we got a phone call from the hedge fund saying, sorry, our assets are being frozen at Lehman. We cannot get our money out. And therefore, even though you were owed a profit, you were owed a compensation for the fact that you made a profit, we can't liquidate that profit because that profit is tied up in these stocks that are held at Lehman, and we can't access them. So tough. You don't get the money. I think about 5 years later, and this is to the credit of the hedge fund because we forgot about it and kind of distracted by other things. And they called up and said, we got our assets back from Lehman and we've done the calculation and here's how much we owe you. And they sent us a nice check. And that was a nice windfall, unexpected windfall. But right in the midst of that 2008 nuttiness, we were making money and managed to make a little bit of money off of that. It took about 5 years to collect, but we made it. But all of those debts, all of those assets that Lehman had, they were worth something. It just was a matter of time before you could get that value out. The crisis at Lehman Brothers, indeed the crisis in most of the banks, and the crisis that banks almost always suffer from, is a liquidity crisis. If you could liquidate all your assets, you could pay off all your debts. But you can't liquidate all your assets. And if you did, you'd be liquidate them at a fire sale. You would get pennies on the dollar, and then you couldn't pay off your debts. So when Lehman went bankrupt, it was about leveraged. I don't know how many of you know what leverage is, but leverage is, it's debt. It was taking on a huge amount of debt to fund its day-to-day activities. So the debt to fund its day-to-day activities was short-term debt. So they had to pay it back every day, every week, every month, but it was short term. And usually the way they paid back the debt was by taking on more debt. So I owe $1 billion today, so I borrow $1 million, pay you off, and now I owe it to somebody else. In the meantime, I've got these assets that are worth more than $1 billion, but I don't want to sell them because I can't sell them, and if I sold them, there would be real mayhem. It would really be problematic. Right? So you fund your cash, you fund your liquidity, you fund the money you owe with more debt, and you roll it over, and you roll it over, and you roll it over, and you get into trouble when you owe the money, and nobody will lend you the money to pay the people you borrowed the money from. Now you're stuck. Nobody will lend you money. And that's what happened to Lehman Brothers. Because people were worried about the value of their assets. They were worried that the value of their assets was not $639 billion, which is what they had, but there was far less than that, and that they wouldn't be able to pay off those debts if they liquidated them all. They were also worried that they would be forced to liquidate those assets very, very quickly, and therefore the value would drop substantially. And again, they wouldn't be able to pay off all their debts. So people stopped funding them. There was also the notion that, the federal government's going to take care of this. And this is a huge role in this, and this is one of the lessons not learned from the financial crisis. The assumption was, all week and all weekend, was that ultimately the government would step in. That ultimately the government would bail Lehman out. Indeed, the assumption had been the entire year of 2008 that the government would bail Lehman out. And why would anybody make that assumption? Because in March of 2008, the government bailed out Bear Stearns, which is just a little bit smaller at the time than Lehman, but a major investment bank. And it didn't let Lehman Brothers go bankrupt. So why would it it wouldn't let Bear Stearns go bankrupt. So why would it let Bear Stearns go bankrupt? And indeed, if you remember, the day after Lehman Brothers goes bankrupt, the government basically bails out Merrill Lynch, and in a massive bailout, the largest bailout, I think, well, maybe not, a massive bailout, they bail out AIG, the insurance company. And a week before they let Lehman Brothers go bankrupt, the federal government took over Freddie and Fannie, the mortgage securitization businesses. Right? So the government is sending here pretty mixed signals, right? We're bailing out those guys, we're bailing out those guys, we're bailing out those guys, we're bailing out all those other guys, but you were not bailing out. Now, when government has that kind of power, when laws are written in such vague ways and such arbitrary ways, it's to allow government to step in and bail some people out and not bail other people out, and when nobody knows what the outcome is going to be. That is the opposite of the rule of law. That is the rule of men. That is the negation of the idea that there are objective laws on the book that we can understand. The laws might even be wrong. But there's immense value in knowing these are the rules, this is what's going to happen if these things happen. And if we do certain things, we can avoid the penalties of the law. It gives objectivity, it gives certainty to what is going to happen. Even when the rules are bad, it's better to have them clear. It's better to have them objectively available to the participants in the marketplace than when they are vague and random and who knows what will happen. So to me, to a large extent, maybe the biggest damage that the financial crisis did, and I think we will pay for this for a very long time, and was the abandonment of the rule of law. Now, granted, the rule of law was already in the financial sector was already on shaky ground, but never on such a scale, as far as I can tell, in American history, has the rule of law just been absolutely, unequivocally ignored. And of course, this was followed up with Obama ignoring again the rule of law and contract law by bailing out the auto industry. But it's all part of the same story. This is emergency powers, which Bush demanded, which Paulson and Bernanke implemented. And they became gods. They could do anything. They could decide who lived and who died, who got a bailout and who didn't get a bailout. And that immense power is deemed 10 years later to have been successful. That is one of the lessons learned for most people from the financial crisis is Paulson and Bernanke did a great job. They used their power wisely. They saved us from a cataclysm. They saved us from the end of the world. And indeed, the bailout of the banks, all these bailouts were fabulously successful. Indeed, the only mistake attributed to Paulson and Bernanke today is that they didn't also bail out Lehman Brothers. If only they had also bailed out Lehman Brothers, they would be saints. They would be saints. The bailouts were so successful, according to this story, that the government actually made money. Taxpayers actually made money on the bailouts. If you add up all the money that went into the bailouts during this period of time, TOP and the auto bailouts and all the other stuff that the Treasury Department did, you add it all up. And then all that money was structured as loans. All that money was returned with interest. And as a consequence of that, the government made profit. Profit, I hate the word, it's not profit. It's I don't know what it is. It's ransom money. There's got to be a word for that. I don't know what it would be. $11 billion on about $700 billion. Not a huge return, but they made good money. It's just proof that government can make money. It's just proof that bailouts work because, look, they were profitable. Loot, I like that. Loot, not profit, loot. The government made $11 billion of loot. Thank you, Jonathan. And the lesson learned from that is, whoa, this is cool. We should do it again. Right? We've got a deficit. Maybe we should use government to invest more, to bail more people out, to make more loans. Again, the wrong lessons are being learned. You know, there's a wide, different views on why Lehman Brothers was not bailed out on that weekend of the 13th and 14th of September in 2008. But from everything I can tell, and from everything I've read, and from the people that know the situation, and the guy, you know, the court appointed somebody to run Lehman Brothers in bankruptcy. And I read an interview with him, and he was asked, why do you think they let it fail? And he basically said, because John Paulson didn't like Lehman Brothers. He didn't like the CEO of Lehman Brothers, Fold or whatever his name was. He didn't like him. I mean, John Paulson, after all, was a Goldman Sachs guy. And Lehman Brothers was a competitor, a small competitor, a competitor you look down on. And John Paulson was not going to bail out Lehman. He would bail out Goldman. Indeed, many would argue that the bailout of AIG was an attempt to bail out Goldman Sachs. By the way, Goldman Sachs on the following day, I think it was September 15th, maybe the 16th, announced that it was converting from an investment bank to a commercial bank in order to fall under too big to fail so that they would certainly be bailed out if they got into enough trouble. Why didn't Lehman do that on Friday, the 12th or the 13th? Why wasn't that the solution? Because Paulson didn't want it to be. A rule of men, not the rule of laws. The rule of men, not a rule of laws. I mean, this is under a Republican administration. This is under a Republican president, a Republican House, a Republican Senate, I think. Maybe they only had the House. They certainly had the House, right? And then, if you remember what happened after Lehman failed, is the markets collapsed, crashed. And of course, many people say today, again, lesson learned, that the crash in the marketplace happened because Lehman failed and there was all this liquidity constraints and people were afraid. And I have a different theory. I can't prove it, unfortunately, although there might be a way to prove it. Maybe one day we'll go and do the financial research necessary. But my theory is different. Yes, Goldman going bankrupt was not good news for financial markets, but financial markets know that if Goldman bankruptcy, all it means is it goes into a bankruptcy court and it unwinds the assets in a regular fashion. Nothing dramatic was going to happen. The end of the world was not before us. What markets really realized in that week following the Goldman bankruptcy was that we were living in a world not dominated by the rules of economics. We were living in a world not dominated by markets, not dominated by laws. We were now living in a world dominated by Ben Bernanke and Paulson, by the Treasury Secretary and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve. Their whim would determine the fate of the U.S. economy. If they made the right calls, it would be good. But then they thought about it. And they realized that Ben Bernanke and John Paulson, to that point, had made all the wrong calls, had not foreseen the crisis. They had not predicted a crisis. They had not foreseen what happened in the U.S. economy. Indeed, quite the opposite. All through 2007 and into 2008, Ben Bernanke was claiming that housing would not cause a financial crisis, was claiming that Freddie and Fannie Mac were completely solvent, was claiming that everything was fine. Not to worry, be happy, things are going to be great. This was the guy now responsible for solving the problems. And what had Paulson done? Nothing. He had bailed out Bear Stearns. I wonder if they'd let Bear Stearns go in March. If Bear Stearns had got bankrupt in March, what would have happened? I predict that markets would have adjusted quickly. Lehman Brothers would have changed its capital structure and never gone bankrupt. I predict that the whole financial crisis would have looked completely different, less severe. But no, instead, they bailed out Bear Stearns. They bailed out Freddie and Fannie. They didn't bail out Goldman, go figure. They bailed out AIG. They bailed out Merrill Lynch. And then, as a response to the markets collapsing, they went to Congress and said, we need $700 billion. We won't tell you exactly what we're going to do with it. We think we're going to buy bad assets. But we want you to give us $700 billion, and we want you to allow the Treasury Secretary to spend that money basically any way he wants to. And by the way, if you don't give us the $700 billion, then the world is going to come to an end. We cannot guarantee that the U.S. economy will not collapse into a massive depression. So you better give us the money because the world is going to end if you don't. This is a Republican administration making this claim. And the House of Representatives, all frantic. Now, what do you think the markets, when they saw this? They said, oh my God. The people in charge, the people who obviously are controlling everything, Bernanke and Paulson, are panicking. They're scared. They don't know what to do. They want power. They have no conception of how to solve this problem. And the markets panicked because they could see their political leaders panic. And the markets tumbled even further. So while initially the House of Representatives voted against TARP, they later reconvened and voted for TARP. And they gave John Paulson $700 billion to spend as he saw fit. And then he takes the CEOs of the 8 largest banks in the United States and forces them to accept a bailout. Even those banks that didn't need it, even those banks that didn't want it. They were forced to take a bailout. The CEO, chairman of Wells Fargo stood up and said, "I don't need your money." Paulson said, "I'm standing here next to your chief regulator. Sure, you need the money, and you better take it. Otherwise, we're going to shut you down." So good banks, bad banks, everybody took the money. You know why they bailed out good banks? Why they gave money to good banks? Because they said, this is the logic. This is political logic. This is a rule of men rather than a rule of laws logic. If we bail everybody out, then the market won't know which banks are bad and which banks were good. And since everybody's being bailed out, they'll assume that all banks are going to do great. But if we only bail out the bad banks, then the market will know what the bad banks are, and they'll get crushed even further. You know what happened right after TARP, right after they announced TARP and they were bailing out everybody? The markets figured out that everybody were bad banks. And they basically plummeted their stocks. They went down 70% after TARP was announced. After the bailout was announced, their stocks went down 70%. They were crushed. Again, yeah, let's not trust markets. Let's not depend on markets. Let's let men with $700 billion go out and decide how to use it. Anyway, a disaster, but it doesn't seem that way because markets collapse, so the market must be at fault. Markets collapse, the markets cannot be trusted. Markets collapse, the markets are the inefficient part of it. And markets collapse because one of their own went bankrupt, so we have to bail people out because if everybody went bankrupt, they collapse even more. Or others went bankrupt, they collapse even more. None of that is true. None of the lessons learned are real lessons learned. The panic was the politicians' panic. The markets responded to that. The panic was a panic because laws were out the window. There was no rule of law. There was no letting the markets work. There was a couple of economic dictators on the march, and they were going to determine everything. And this is under George W. Bush, not Obama. George W. Bush. Obama then continued the trend, taking a big chunk of money and bailing out the auto industry, violating contract law, violating property rights. Sure. But this was Bush. These were Republicans. These were the so-called defenders of Western civilization doing this. Not those evil Democrats. So the lesson is government can bail out. Government does a good job saving us. And markets are disaster. Markets panic. Markets are impulsive. And we need mechanisms. We need to give more power to politicians, more power to bureaucrats, more power to regulators, more power to the Federal Reserve so that they can address these awful market failures, these disasters that the market inflicts on us. We need to give them the power. So we did. So we passed a regulation called Dodd-Frank, which gave regulators a massive amounts of power over the U.S. economy. It includes a board that is responsible for systemic risk entities. So now every bank in the United States, or not every bank, the big banks in the United States are regulated by 7 different regulatory agencies, seven different regulatory agencies. Instead of 5 before. We think we're better protected by having 7. The 5 were a disaster. 7's a bigger disaster. Who's the boss? Which laws are responsible? They all have conflicting regulations. Again, we're setting ourselves up in the long run for the rule of men, not the rule of laws. And what is the rule of men? It's authoritarianism. The rule of men is a dictator. We already have, to some extent, economic dictatorships, particularly at the time of crisis. But when the next crisis happens, or the crisis after that, it won't just be economic dictators, it will be dictators. Because once you accept that laws are out and men can make decisions in a time of crisis, no matter what the law is, then you have given up on freedom. You've given up on objectivity. You have given up on rules. Might as well have the dictator. All right, questions. Any questions you have? Feel free to use that super chat feature. Nobody's used it today yet. I see people have questions, but all you have to do is, I don't know, $1, $2, $5, $500, $5,000, and I will answer whatever question you want. Just put a $ in front of it, and it shall be done. So here we are. We've got Dodd-Frank, this massive bill that regulates and now institutionalizes too big to fail. Gives more power to regulators, to the Federal Reserve, to the Treasury than ever before. It takes away any semblance of objectivity with regard to the rules of the game and replaces objectivity with power, with individuals with power. We have gone from America, the land of the free, where the rule of law is primary, to a system of government in which we have given individuals immense power over our lives. Now, this power doesn't manifest itself fully in normal times, but it explodes. It just goes out of control in times of crisis. And that's what I expect the next crisis. I expect these little economic dictators to be worse. And it's hard to be worse than Bernanke and Paulson. So, again, lessons learned by the popular press. Bernanke and Paulson are heroes. No, Bernanke and Paulson are the villains. Lesson learned, bailout works. We should have done more of them, not less. No, bailouts don't work. Bailouts created a disaster, and we'll talk about the consequences, long-term consequences of all of that. And the biggest long-term consequence, again, is the disrespect for the rule of law. The Economist suggests, where is it? I saw this in a paragraph, that the problem was, yeah, we bailed out the bank. That was great. Great job. Great job. Right? So we have no choice but to bail out failed banks. That is the conclusion of The Economist. But what about bailing out households? Why didn't we bail out households? People who lost their jobs, people who lost their homes. Now, if I remember right, unemployment insurance was extended to 100 months. That's a bailout. But the argument here was 100 months, 100 weeks, I think, 2 years. No, we should have bailed out households. We should have bailed out their homes. We should have, I don't know, the government should have spent enough money to provide them all jobs. We should have guaranteed them jobs, maybe, guaranteed them income. The lesson learned is not bailouts are bad. The lesson learned is that bailouts are good. And next time we should double up on them. Next time we should bail out every single individual out there in addition to everything else. So I don't know what is going to happen next time we have a financial crisis, and there will be a financial crisis here sometime soon. Because we have given more power, more influence, more arbitrary power to the worst elements in our government. We've given arbitrary power for people to dictate everything, every aspect of the economy in a time of crisis. All right, so here's a question. What is the problem with the 2008 bailout in the short, near term? Well, in the short, near term, the problem with the bailouts is that it completely and utterly distorted the allocation of capital in the economy. It disincentivized banks from making loans. It incentivized them to make the wrong kind of loans. Primarily, banks have been incentivized for a long time to make mortgage loans and not to make business loans. It created an environment of fear and uncertainty, which diminished businessmen's motivation and incentive to invest in new projects. And as a consequence, the economy has grown dramatically less than it would have otherwise. If you look coming out of a recession, how economies grow, they usually, they shrink during a recession, then they grow a little bit slowly, and then they accelerate and they grow really fast. And in American history, usually when we get out of a recession, we climb very fast and we go back to the growth rate from before the recession happened. This never happened with the Great Recession. That's why it's called the Great Recession. There was economic growth after the recession, but it's been meager. It's been very, very slow. And yes, it has increased a little bit, and I emphasize a little bit, under Trump, because he has walked back some of the worst of Obama's policies and freed up the confidence of businessmen to make investments and to grow the economy. But we're still not back anywhere close to being back to where we were before the recession, or on the growth rate that would have been projected from before the recession. And we have today all the structural problems that existed before the crisis. We have the same we have awful regulatory mechanisms that are going to just create more havoc long term. And you can't just think in terms of short near future, because we don't just live in the short near future. We're already 10 years away from the crisis. It's not near anymore. But what's going to happen when the next crisis happens? You still got Dodd-Frank. You've still got this attitude about bailouts. Donald Trump is like 100 times worse than George Bush when it comes to his view of his autocratic power and his willingness to intervene with business and to tell them how to run their business and how to structure their businesses in a time of crisis. I mean, God help us if we had a financial crisis and Donald Trump was president. He would be 10 times worse than George Bush, and I fear 10 times worse than Obama, because he would start managing the economy. He would start managing Wall Street. He would start telling them what to do. And since he is the kind of person who is very much about the rule of man versus the rule of law, very much a person who likes to get even with people he doesn't like, then God help those people who might have not provided Trump with loans over the years, those investment banks that might have treated him perceivably badly. Again, we have shifted to the rule of men over the rule of laws, and therefore it's all about relationships. And if you have a bad relationship with the president or with his chief regulators at a time of crisis, right? Then you're in big, big trouble. You're in big, big trouble. What else did you ask there? Now, again, yeah, I mean, life is good because we got used to 2-3% growth. Maybe we got one quarter of 4% growth. Maybe we'll get 2 quarters of 4% growth. Remember, under Obama, we had 3 quarters of 4% growth. But that's pathetic. That's because we used to mediocrity. And that's all a consequence of the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates artificially low. It's all a consequence of the bailouts. It's all a consequence of regulation, of banks constrained, of financial industry constrained, of an entire universe where things just run inefficiently. Cost of education is through the roof. Cost of healthcare is through the roof. Everything's through the roof. Those kind of things are through the roof. Luckily, we still have a sector that's relatively free in Silicon Valley. That might be going away. And there's a massive danger now that Donald Trump is whatever good things he's done is going to completely screw it all up because of his trade war. I mean, which is a massive, massive danger. It's not trivial. Just because things have gone well so far doesn't mean they're going to go well in the future. We're sitting on a powder keg. And if this trade war goes badly and the economy does suddenly badly, what does Donald Trump do then? How does he respond? So, no, I mean, we're in deep, deep trouble. As long as the economy is growing, as long as everything's okay, even if we grow slowly, then nobody seems to care and everything is fine. But what if things go badly? You know, we haven't had another recession in 10 years. We're due for a recession. The Federal Reserve is increasing interest rates again. We've got all kinds of distortions in the capital structure. We've been investing in all the wrong things because of zero interest rates. Trade wars cannot go right. There is no right way. There's no good way a trade war can go. The only advantage right now is the trade war is still small. He still hasn't completely, gone crazy with it. But he could. He could. There is no such thing as a good trade war. There's no such thing. Housing, is still going up, still expensive. Most of the mortgages are still guaranteed by the U.S. government. 70% of all mortgages in the United States are guaranteed by the U.S. government. What have we learned from the financial crisis? Nothing. Government is still everywhere. It's involved in everything. So the danger, the risks are that we haven't changed anything structurally in our economy to prevent another financial crisis. We haven't liberalized that economy. We haven't freed it up. We haven't deregulated. We haven't made it resistant to crisis by liberating market forces. And at the same time, we've given the authorities, the people in charge, more power. More power. Come on, guys. If you want to ask a question, use the Super Chat feature. That's what it's there for. Don't try to sneak in questions so that, I might answer them by chance. $2. People are using, what it was $4.99. You can afford $4.99 to ask a question. So we've learned all the wrong lessons from the financial crisis. The real lesson ultimately from the financial crisis is that government regulations, government controls, government intervention, government bailouts, the rule of men over the rule of law, cause disasters. And if we want to really experience the full potential of the U.S. economy, if we want to really see economic growth, if we want to really get rich, to really be successful, to really prosper and succeed economically, then the answer is less regulations, less control, less power in the hands of individuals, politicians, regulators, and cronies. More freedom, more competition. Let the markets work. Let the markets work. That's the lesson of the financial crisis. But create markets. Part of the misdiagnosis is that people perceive that we had a free market in finance in 2007-8, when we didn't. We had a heavily controlled, regulated, manipulated market in mortgages, marketing in housing, and market in finance. All right, so I think we're in worse shape than we were before the financial crisis. I think the next crisis, as a consequence, has the potential to be a lot worse. Not because I think there are necessarily worse things in the world out there right now, but because I think that the government's response to the next crisis is going to be worse than the government's response to this crisis, to the 2008 crisis. They are emboldened by the perception of Bernanke and Paulson as heroes. They're emboldened by the perception that the bailouts worked, by the perception that they should have done more bailouts, not less. And we will pay for this crisis for many, many, many years, well into the future. All right. Jonathan is asking, is poverty in the U.S. increasing? If so, do you suspect, as I do, that this is due to government distortions of the economy? I don't think poverty in the U.S. is increasing. I don't see any evidence that poverty is increasing in the U.S. It's flat. You're seeing very little of people coming out of poverty. What you're really seeing is a shrinking of the middle class. But even there, most of the shrinkage of the middle class is people moving up, not people moving down. So I don't really think poverty in the United States is increasing significantly. I think what is happening is that people who are poor have fewer and fewer and fewer opportunities to rise out from poverty. People who are poor are to a large extent stuck in poverty. And they can't get out because we have licensing laws, because we have minimum wage laws, because we penalize companies from growing too fast, we penalize companies from reinvesting their capital. And companies are not convinced that there's going to be dramatic economic growth in the future, and therefore they're not investing, so there are fewer jobs. Poverty in the U.S. I don't think is increasing. By the way, for all those who say, "Oh, but under Trump, there's massive employment." Well, if you look at employment participation rates, the number of people who could work, who are choosing not to work, is still very, very high. Do you remember when Trump, in his campaign, used to make fun of the Obama numbers, right? He would call them crook numbers, fake news. And he'd emphasize the participation rates. Well, he's using exactly the same numbers, calculating exactly the same way, and because it's his numbers, the numbers are great, the numbers are accurate, the numbers represent everything, and nobody challenges that. So, labor participation rates are still problematic in this country. But yeah, to the extent that there is poverty in the U.S., to the extent that the economy is not growing, to the extent that there are people who would like jobs who do not have jobs, to the extent that there are people who still live off of welfare and don't do anything, all of that, and primarily the extent to which there are no opportunities, and that some people are just stuck, all of that is due to government distortions of the economy and due to government education, to the government monopoly over education. Those two things are what hamper the U.S. economy and what restrict what I think the U.S. economy could grow at 6%, 7% economic growth, particularly now, because I think as you unwind all these regulations, the amount of energy that you would release, the amount of innovation, the amount of investment is just unimaginable. But the U.S. economy is, I think, doomed to grow at 2 to 3% because of the massive government intervention distortions that exist, and it's due to have recessions and other things that are really, really bad. Right? Somebody's arguing here that fascism is a better economic system than capitalism. That is so ridiculous and silly, just silly. There is no economic system that has produced any kind of significant wealth that is not capitalist in nature. And I include China here. China, those areas in China where you have seen massive wealth creation and economic growth are those areas in China where the government has laid off. Now, China is fascist in the way it runs part of the country, and other parts of the country and other industries it leaves alone. China does not run its tech industry as a fascist industry. China is very selective about what it manages and what it doesn't manage, what it leaves alone and what it doesn't leave alone. And if you want to look at the sectors that have shown massive economic growth in China, they're those sectors in which the government has left alone. Now, if you want to understand China and its economy, there's a wonderful book called How China Became Capitalist. Now, it's mistitled because China never became capitalist. But China doesn't manage those portions of its economy that have led to economic growth. It manages those portions of the economy that have led to very slow economic growth. So state-run companies grow very slowly in real terms. It's the private sector, the sector that's left alone. It's those provinces that have been left alone, those areas that are unregulated, uncontrolled, that have boomed and exploded. Read how China became capitalist by, oh my God, Nobel Prize winning economist from Chicago, Ronald Coase. He wrote the book when he was 101 years old, but it was a brilliant book. He wrote it with a Chinese co-author, brilliant book. And it shows exactly that. It's leaving things alone, not being fascist, that allowed China to gain economically. And China's still a poor country, a very poor country on a per capita basis. China is where the United States was decades and decades and decades and decades ago. So no, managed economies do not work. Fascist, socialist, doesn't matter. Managed economies have never, ever, ever worked, and they do not work. What we have today in the world is mixed economies. China is one form of mixed economy. The United States is another form of mixed economy. Sweden is a slightly different form of mixed economy. Russia is a mixed economy. Elements of freedom and elements of control. Some places have more control, some places have less control. But China, in certain sectors and in certain districts, has less controls than the United States. Has a free economy than the United States. Yeah, China has a low GDP per capita than Mexico and a lot of other countries. It is a very poor country on a GDP per capita basis, whatever value that has. All right, let's see the other questions here. So yeah, I mean, government distortion of the economy is creating the slow economic growth, the inability of the poor to rise up from poverty. The government distortions of the economy have enriched many people through the financial markets. Money has flown into the financial markets, allowing for financial assets to rise in value, where a lot of people are stuck in jobs where they get no wages. You know, we can talk about Amazon and so on. But, and you know, maybe I will. I'll talk a little bit about Amazon and Amy Peikoff's appearance in Tucker and the whole Tucker Amazon thing. I want to just say a few things, just on a purely economics basis. I think there's other things to say, but certainly on the economics. Okay, let's take these other questions. Isn't Trump already bailing out industry, farm subsidies to mitigate trade wars? Of course, he's bailing out industries, but of course, tariffs are bailout of industries. Why do you think he's doing tariffs? To bail out the steel industry. Why is he bailing out the steel industry? I don't know. Because he likes the steel industry, because they voted for him, because they love him because of it, because he promised to bail them out, because it sounds good, because it's a populist thing to do, because Americans seem to be supporting it. That's why he's doing it. It makes zero economic sense to bail out the U.S. steel industry. U.S. is not a very efficient producer of steel. Other countries do it better, do it cheaper. Let's import cheap steel so we can make stuff from that steel cheaply. Yes, so the tariffs to begin with are bailouts of industries, and then the farm subsidies to mitigate the tariffs that other countries are placing on our soybeans and our farm products are another way in which Trump is bailing out industry. Yeah, of course. But that's Trump's MO. Trump is, I call him central planner in chief. He's a central planner. He views the job of president as the job of a CEO. No. Presidents are not CEOs. Presidents are there to protect the individual rights of Americans, not to run the economy. All right. So the argument about the steel industry, we need it for war, would make some sense if the people who were manufacturing steel were not our allies, countries like Canada, who for some reason we want to go to a trade war with Canada. How does that make any sense? What do we got against Canadians? What do we got for Canadians? What the hell? Are Canadians not going to supply us with steel when we go to war? But I've said often that the solution, if you really think that a certain industry is crucial to the security of the United States, then the government should pay that industry to have idle factories that they can turn on with a flip of a switch. In time of war, they can just turn it on. So pay U.S. Steel $1 billion every year to have a certain number of plants available just in case we go to war. Now, I think it's all a bogus excuse. I don't think that's the real issue. But that would be the solution. It wouldn't be to put tariffs. Tariffs are stupid. Tariffs make U.S. steel less productive, less efficient, and therefore when we go to war, we'll have a less efficient, less productive company producing the steel that we're sending our boys to battle in. Is there anything objectivism can do at the local state level? Is there an objectivist party? There isn't an objectivist political party. There is something called the Capitalist Party, which a couple of my friends have put together. You can look up their and they've got a good political platform, and it makes complete sense. But to have a real political party, you need a lot of money. You need that money to go invest it, to register yourself as a political party in various states, then to find candidates, to fund those candidates, to run those candidates for various offices. Where's the money? Where are the candidates? We're tiny. Look, what do I have? 12,000 subscribers on YouTube, half of whom hate me. If I ran for president, maybe I'd get 6,000 votes total in the entire country. Right? That's based on my YouTube numbers, at least. Right? So what are we talking about? Where is this objectivist party going to get any votes or any money or any support or anything? Candidates. We can barely field enough candidates out there. There's so few of us. So, okay, so my YouTube numbers are maybe not. Maybe there are 100,000 people out there that think somewhat similarly to me. That's not enough. You need millions and millions and millions of people to launch a political movement. And we just don't have it. An objectivist candidate, a real objectivist candidate, an objectivist candidate that didn't hold back, that said what he really believed, and somebody like me can't hold back because everything I've ever said is on YouTube, would get ripped to shreds, would defeated in a landslide. The American people are now ready to elect an objectivist. They're ready to elect Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Those are the two candidates. They're the ones. You know, they got about the same number of votes, right? Hillary got more, but you know, you can correct for the fact that everybody, the way the whole thing is structured. But no, there's zero chance that an objectivist political party can be successful. And therefore there isn't one. When there are enough people to justify an objectivist political party, there will be one. And this capitalist political party is, for all intents and purposes, an objectivist political party. And how much support has it garnered? Where the billionaires to come and fund it? Where the candidates running on its agenda? It just doesn't happen. How do objectivists deal with seeming contradictions and org with monopoly and violating property rights? The state can protect property rights. Well, no, because the state, in an ideal state, in a objectivist state, can't violate property rights. It has no authority to violate property rights. Indeed, it is banned from violating property rights. Its only function is to protect individual rights, including property rights. So there is no sense in which the government has a monopoly over violating property rights. It has a monopoly over the retaliatory use of force. Retaliatory means protection, not violation. Now, implementing that is not easy. Implementing that takes work, but the idea that a capitalist government has the authority to violate rights or monopoly on violating rights is absurd. It's the exact opposite. Thoughts on the current U.S. trade deficit compared to 2008 and what that may mean for the near future. Sorry if you've answered this question already. I don't think trade deficits matter one iota. I don't think they matter at all. I don't understand anybody who thinks they do. I think the government deficit matters a lot, how much the government borrows every year to fund its spending. I think the total amount of government spending matters a lot. The fact that the government deficit is so massive today, and the fact that another crisis like the 2008 crisis would require more quantitative easing, which it could get really bad really, really quickly in terms of inflation, in terms of a collapse of the dollar. But the trade deficit doesn't matter one iota. And I've said this from the beginning. Who cares? I have a huge trade deficit with my grocery store. I give them dollars, I get stuff. They never buy stuff from me. Why does that matter? It doesn't matter at all. So trade deficits ain't significant. And the trade deficits, indeed, if anything, the trade deficit reflects a certain amount of confidence of foreign investors in the United States. Because I've said this before, but the trade deficit reflects the fact that foreigners want to invest in the U.S. And how do they get dollars in order to invest in the U.S.? They get dollars by selling stuff to us. And then they take the dollars that they get from selling us stuff and they invest it in America. There's massive amounts of capital that flow into America, that buy our government debt, that buy our real estate, that buy our businesses, that invest in the United States. A trade deficit is not bad for the U.S. It's not bad for anybody. There are circumstances in which a trade deficit makes sense, and the circumstances in which a trade surplus makes sense. And the only way to determine what those circumstances are is to let the market decide. And the market has basically decided that in the case of that there are all these poor countries that can manufacture stuff, we in the United States are very good in the ideas business, in the design business, in the consulting business, in the finance business, in the brains business. Let them make the stuff and let us have the ideas. And stuff you measure as a trade deficit when you buy stuff. Ideas you don't measure as an export. How much value is placed on the intellectual property that Apple has, the innovation and so on, that makes possible the iPhones that are then imported from China into the United States? Where is that in the equation of trade? It isn't. It isn't. Only the physical good gets counted. Somebody asked me, one of the questions, whether stocks and bonds get counted in the trade, right? Because the Chinese are buying stocks and bonds. Does that count as us exporting stocks and bonds to them? No. The trade deficit only deals with trade in real goods, in actually goods. It doesn't deal in financial assets. That is a different calculation that is being tracked. We have a massive surplus in capital investment. More money flows into the United States than flows out of the United States. That's a good thing, bad thing, that's the reality. And it works fine. There's nothing wrong with a trade deficit. Nothing. There are lots of other problems with the U.S. economy, primarily government spending. But I'll say it again, nothing wrong with a trade deficit. It just means we have a lot of money because we're very productive and we come up with great ideas that produce huge amounts of profits, look, i.e. Apple. And we use that money to buy goods that people make more efficiently outside of the country so we can get them cheap. So, and those people then invest their dollars in the United States, and because we get them cheap, we get more money left over in our paycheck to buy other things or to invest. We don't do a lot of investing and saving in the U.S. That's part of the problem. Part of the problem is Americans don't save. So if you really want a problem, it's that we don't save. Chinese save a lot. The Japanese save a lot. Their savings get funneled into the United States through the trade deficit. But that's nothing wrong with that. That's great. Isn't it good that the Chinese are saving? Because if the Chinese didn't save, who would save? We would have to save ourselves. We'd rather consume. Now, I don't think that's a good thing, that we don't save. But if that's a problem, then let's deal with the problem of Americans not saving enough. And I think they're not. Let's not talk about trade. Trade is irrelevant. And that's true. If you actually want to reduce the amount of imports into the United States, then Americans, if they saved more, interest rates would go down. America would become a less attractive place for people like the Chinese to invest in. Therefore, they would have less of an incentive to sell us stuff to get dollars, and that's how the trade deficit would change. Maybe. Certainly not by tariffs. As I've said many times, because they want to keep investing in the United States, they buy dollars, which drives the value of the dollar up, which lowers the cost of importation to us. So the trade deficit right now under Obama with the trade wars is bigger than it's ever been. Under Trump, not Obama. I get the two mixed up because they're easy to get confused with, Trump and Obama. It's just I know economics is hard. Economics is not easy. So, I guess I don't blame you that some of you are confused. Economics is not hard. It's not easy. But I've tried lots of explanations to explain this issue of trade. And trade wars, tariffs, never, ever, ever make sense. As a Canadian, if we went to war with the US and cut off steel, you'd send 5 tanks straight into Ottawa. It would be over in 12 hours a day max. Yeah, exactly. Canadians can't fight. Right? I mean, give me a break. If we had no steel and Canada refused to supply us with steel, we just take it over. That would make more sense. That would make literally more sense. Those 5 tanks to Ottawa would make more sense to me than tariffs. Yeah. Somebody says economics are dry and people are enamored by emotional arguments. That's why I'm trying to be emotional. I'm trying to mix real economic, truthful knowledge with emotion. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We've gone over an hour already. All right. So, any other questions? No, I think we're done. I think we'll give it a day. I want to talk about Amazon and food stamps and all that, and I will. What is this MRI, 650 in the US, 300 in Italy? Who cares? Why does that matter exactly? We're rich in the US. We can afford more money, right? So even if it costs more in the US, why does that make it bad? Maybe in Italy you're subsidizing it. Maybe people have too many MRIs as a consequence. I don't know. But why is an MRI, the cost of an MRI, a standard for anything? For anything. And by the way, an MRI in the US does not cost $650. I know because I called up not long ago and asked to do an MRI, and they said, if you pay cash, it's $300. So an MRI in the US costs $300. The only reason it's priced at $650 is because of the whole distortion of the US health market, which I was going to talk about today but didn't have time. But I'll just give you a teaser about it. And that distortion is caused by the fact that when a Medicare or Medicaid patient goes in to get an MRI, the government will not reimburse the MRI place the full cost of the MRI. They'll underpay them. Right? So then, in order for the MRI place, the imaging company, to make money, it has to overcharge the rest of us in the private sector. Yeah, I mean, we have a terrible healthcare system in the United States. Terrible healthcare system. It's better than Italy's. When Berlusconi got sick, just on the Italy thing, when Berlusconi got sick a few years ago, he was prime minister of Italy at the time. He was really sick and they were worried about him. He didn't go to a hospital in Italy. He didn't fly to neighboring France, which according to the United Nations has the best healthcare system in the world. Guess what he did? Guess where he went? He got on a plane and he flew to the United States, because we still have the best doctors, the best equipment, the best hospitals, the Mayo Clinic, the best places in the world, because we're still a little bit free. But that little bit of freedom is disappearing. That little bit of freedom is disappearing. And it's true for the average person in the United States. Healthcare is getting more and more and more expensive. But worse than that, it's getting more and more difficult to figure out. It's getting more and more obscure. It's getting more and more complicated. It's getting more and more bureaucratic. And all of that is caused by government controls and government regulation. There's a sense in which, much of Europe has socialized medicine, 100% government financed and to some extent government controlled medicine. The ideal is 100% private medicine. What the United States has is something like 70 to 80% controlled by government and 20 to 30% private. And for some people, maybe for a lot of people, that's actually worse than socialized medicine. I buy that. Some people are better off under socialized medicine than under the current American system. But that's because the current American system is not free. We have a horrific mixed economy. And one of the next shows, I'm going to go through a paper that I read about this that explains why the American healthcare system is so perverted, so distorted, so corrupted by this mixed economy and how it all works, by the cowardice ultimately by the cowardice of politicians and their interest in shifting costs rather than just taking on the costs through government. But anyway, and therefore all the controls that they impose on. Sometimes, yeah. Anyway, I'm gonna tell you the whole thing now, and I don't want to do that. I want to leave it for another show. All right. Somebody wrote, this is such a wrong way of looking at the world. I knew the guy who invented the CAT scan. You're paying for his mansion. No, you're not. You're paying for life-saving treatment. You're paying for an amazing technology. You're paying to have your life improved. You're paying for better health. He deserves the mansion for saving your life, for saving the lives of billions of people. He deserves much more of a mansion. He deserves a statue and a sculpture and a street named after him and recognized as one of the great heroes of our era. You're not paying for his mansion. You're paying for the values that he is providing with you. He provided with you. He provided it. It didn't come manna from heaven. It didn't come from God. All right. I'm resisting getting angry. I will, when am I going to see you again? Maybe tomorrow. I might do a show from New York. We'll see. But certainly on Thursday, I'm going to have Ben Baer with me, and we're going to be talking about conspiracy theories. I think it'd be an interesting conversation. And we'll see after that what shows we have after that. Those of you who are in England, I encourage you to come to the event with Douglas Murray. I'm doing an event, me and Douglas Murray on stage. Who is killing Western civilization is the topic at hand. Claire Fox will be the moderator. It's going to be on September 21st in London. And please come. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be really interesting. Douglas is an interesting guy. We're going to agree. We're going to disagree. It's going to be good. I hope you make it. Those of you not coming to London, please go to my Patreon site, including those who are going to London. All of you should go to my Patreon site and support the show. If you think somebody says I'm the best speaker on YouTube, it certainly doesn't feel that way based on how other speakers do on Patreon and by subscribers. So help me out, both by supporting me on Patreon, but also by sharing this video and sharing other videos. Share. So other people get exposed, and as a consequence, we get more followers and we get more supporters, and we grow this thing and we take over the world. All right. I just revealed my true motivation. The power lust. Yeah, conspiracy theories should be really interesting, Pam. Should be really interesting. So, and Ayn Rand said a lot about conspiracy theories. And we're going to talk about what Ayn Rand said about conspiracy theories and why they're so popular and why they're wrong. What really moves the world? Is it the Bilderbergs and the Rothschilds? Is it Wall Street? Is it Jews in the background? Is it the elders of Zion? If it is, they haven't told me about it. So, we'll find out when we talk to Ben Baer what Ayn Rand thought about all of those. All right, thanks everybody. I will see you on Thursday, maybe sooner, but certainly on Thursday. Have a great week. Bye everybody.